Hello, I'm Doug Musio. This is City Talk. New Yorkers. Who are they? How many are there? Where do they come from? Where do they live? What does the future look like? Joining me now to talk about New York City, its people, and its neighborhoods is Dr. Joseph Salvo, Director of the Population Division at the New York City Department of City Planning. The division is the city's in-house demographic consultant, providing population estimates and projections for infrastructure and capital planning and policy formation. Dr. Salvo was one of the premier demographers in the United States, a fellow of the American Statistical Association, former president of the Association of Public Data Users, and advisor to the Census Bureau. He is also the recipient of the Sloan Public Service Award from the Fund for the City of New York and is a city treasure. Joining us later in the program is Stacey Cumberbatch, New York Census Coordinator. Prior to her appointment in January 2009, Ms. Cumberbatch served as the Chief of Staff to the New York City Housing Authority. She has also served as Chief of Staff and Special Counsel to New York City's Deputy Mayor for Legal Affairs and as an Assistant New York State Attorney General. Welcome, Joe. Is New York City the most diverse city in the country?
Well, talking to a native New Yorker, so I'll tell you right off the bat that absolutely.
Okay. Now, how do you measure diversity? So we're the most diverse. What does that mean?
Well, you can look at languages, you could look at ethnicity, you could look at ancestry, you can look at the makeup of the city from so many different ways, but every way you look at it, we are arguably, perhaps, one of the most diverse cities in the world, certainly.
Talk about some of these criteria. How many languages are spoken in New York?
Well, we've run the list out, essentially. If you talk about...
So it's everybody,
yeah.
Every language.
Because you'll always find in every neighborhood a small group of people who speak a particular language. And once you get into dialects of particular languages, the sky's the limit. So we've really, in many ways, gone beyond the lists, truly beyond description in some ways. And certainly, I would argue that some of our boroughs, as I'll tell you, have incredible communities of people that run the gamut racially and ethnically.
So we literally are the world.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Let's start with some questions that I raised in the intro. How many New Yorkers are there today?
Well, today in demography is July 1, 2008,
okay,
which is the latest population estimate. And that puts the city at 8,363,000 people. Way up from 2000 when the city just inched over 8 million officially for the first time.
Now, is this number the most New Yorkers ever?
Yes.
And the growth since 2000 has been fairly substantial, as you suggest, a couple of 100,000 people.
It's actually huge. It's over 4%. It's over 300,000 people. And you need to put that in context. Most older cities in the United States are not gaining population, especially in the Northeast and the Midwest. And as a result, New York actually is doing very well compared to these other places.
Let's put this in some historical perspectives. Go back 100 years. We're in, July 1st, 1908? 2010, 1910 census. What does New York look like in 1910?
New York is primarily a European city with an influx of millions of immigrants. European, though, in nature. There were people from the West Indies here, though. There were some people from Asia. But by and large, we were a very diverse European city with many, many languages spoken. I often think back and to myself about what diversity meant back then. And certainly from the standpoint of many countries and many languages, we were a very diverse place. But today, we have really blown the lid off of the definition of diversity, so to speak. 100 years later, we're talking about a city that is multi-ethnic and multiracial. Let's go back to 1970, for example.
Okay, let's do that.
1970, the city was essentially 63% or so European white. Today, the mainly Italian, Irish, German. We're talking about the immigrants, Eastern European, Jewish. We're talking about the immigrants who came here 100 years ago and their descendants. Then the immigration laws were changed in the 1960s, and New York City was one of those special places that benefited from this tremendous influx of immigrants.
Okay, let's look at, some of the beautiful graphics that you've produced. You look at the population in 1970, and you've got about 7.9 million people. Then you've got a decline into 1980, an uptick in 1990, 2000, as you say, we break the 8 million, and we're at about 8.36. And let's look at the sort of the racial ethnic breakdown of this population. Talk about that.
Okay,
and how it's changed.
As I said, we were a European city in 1970. And we had significant contingents in 1970 of black and Hispanic population. And by the way, these categories are just, again, overly simplistic for New York City. Admittedly, right off the bat, I can tell you.
This is one of my questions. I mean, when you talk about black, white, Hispanic, and Asian,
it doesn't do us justice. Hell no. Doesn't do us justice.
Is it at all useful to use those? It is,
because when you look at the chart and you look at the transition that's occurred, it gives us a general idea of what's happened. So we see that European white population has diminished to about a third of the city total. We see that the black population has gone to about 25% of the total. We see that the Hispanic population is approaching 30%, and that the Asian population is over 10%. But that is an oversimplification, because within each one of those categories, we have a multitude of groups. In the white population, you have the Eastern European populations coming in, the former Yugoslavia, persons from Albania, persons from Croatia. All you need to do is spend some time in your home borough in Queens, and you'll see very, very quickly.
Excuse me. And Brooklyn. We'll do a borough tour. Go ahead.
Then the black population is now heavily Caribbean and most recently African. Okay, and what's happened is many of the people who came here from the southern states in the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s are now migrating out, giving way to the Black West Indian population. Hispanic population, once all Puerto Rican, heavily Puerto Rican, is now a mix of Puerto Rican, Dominican, Mexican, Ecuadorian, Colombian. All the groups have come in. And then you look at the Asian population, historically about 40 or 50% Chinese, and still that way. But now we have immigrants from India. We have immigrants from the Indian subcontinent. We have immigrants from Bangladesh coming in larger numbers. So what's happening is the city, even internally, within each one of these groups that you can see in the chart, it's a gross oversimplification, because each one of those chunks in the chart is a very, very diverse group of people that really defies description using demography. But demographers like to classify things. And admittedly, this is very limited.
Okay, so that's New York City now, if you will, but also New York City in the future. You're projecting about 8.4 million in 2010, but 9.1 million in 2030. Where are these people going? What are the boroughs? Where are they headed?
Well, each borough is slated to increase, and in the sustainability plan, you'll see that most of that increase...
this plan, NYC,
it's a sustainability plan, and most of the increase occurs along mass transit lines, because the city acknowledges, and we all have discovered, that the saving grace for all of us is mass transit here in the city, and there are actually opportunities for growth along many of these mass transit lines. And as a result of that and of the continual influx of immigrants, and now more recently, domestic migrants. We have people coming in from other parts of the country. We think perhaps recently in greater numbers, fewer people leaving. It's causing the city to become even more of a magnet, producing a population increase.
You talk about in the various studies the churning of the population. Talk about what this churning means.
When I give presentations and I talk to people, I love talking about this, because everyone wants to know, if we teach people English, over time, shouldn't we observe that more people speak English, perhaps? Some people might be critical and say, I never hear people speaking English. I always hear people speaking other languages. Or people come to me from social services and they say, I've done this for years. How come I have a steady stream of new people? My job never ends. And what I tell them is this: new people on the block is the norm in New York. If you take a look at the overall change in population, it does not begin to tell you about what's really going on underneath. Underneath what we have are hundreds of thousands of people moving out and hundreds of thousands of people moving in almost every year. This continuous churning of population, continuous influx of immigrants. Why? Because New York is as much a process as it is a place. People come here, they do well, and they get up and they go. It's part of the natural progression. When they go, maybe they have those English skills, and we get another crop of people who come in and speak another language and need to be trained to become citizens, to become residents of New York City. And in essence, what happens is that this injection of vitality is what makes the city exciting. It's what makes the city vital. It's what's not happening in many cities in the Midwest. Okay? And it's what exhausts your friends when they come here to visit you and they say they have to go home and spend a week on vacation just to get over being in the city for a few days. Because when you look around you, you see motion, you see constant energy. And that energy is what makes this place really special. And what it does is it perpetuates itself. People want to come here and want to live here.
Okay. So in a sense, we've talked about New York as the global city, the melting pot city, or the mixing city. Let's look at the neighborhood city, and let's focus briefly on my borough, the borough of Queens. Talk to me about Queens. I know you're excited about this. We've talked about this in the past. Talk about what's going on in Queens as sort of a microcosm of what's going on in the city, even though you can't.
Well, Queens continues to be the immigrant borough. I'm not going to take anything away from the other boroughs, but Queens tends to be the symbol. I guess best symbolized by the number 7 train.
Made famous by John Rocker, the ex-Braves pitcher.
That's right. So you get on at Times Square, you go under the East River, and then you go over to Sunnyside, Woodside, Jackson Heights, Elmhurst, Corona, and Flushing. Each one of those stops, and you take a look, you get on and you get off. Something I advise people to do, to go and get themselves one of those daily Metro cards, and they get on and off the train and they sample the food and look around and look at the people.
And the thing is that you're above ground, so you can see all this.
You can see a ton. In that corridor, you have a foreign-born population that is the size of a major American city. We're talking about 500,000 foreign-born, just in that corridor there, coming from all different types of countries. And what's amazing is that people generally get along in a situation where in other places they may not. There's an understanding when you come here. You come here for a reason. Most immigrants come here to work. They come here for family. They come here to higher quality of life. And there's an understanding that there are boundaries and that people get along. They may not love each other, but they tolerate each other. But Doug, I'm going to do something. I'm going to move from your home borough and I'm going to go into Brooklyn. The reason I'm going to go into Brooklyn is there's something competing with your train in Queens, and it's the B and the Q train that runs from Prospect Park down to the beach, to the ocean, as my colleague says all the time, the train running to the ocean. Along that corridor, you now have different, not only ethnic groups, but religious groups living side by side with each other, okay, and living well side by side with each other. Bangladeshi, Muslim population, Orthodox Jewish population, all these populations growing along that corridor there. And people from various Arab countries, the Eastern European Jewish population of the previous generations living there, it's all coming together, religious, ethnic, and racial, coming together in that corridor in a way that makes Brooklyn actually very, very unique.
Well, I mean, just Bensonhurst alone, where my mother grew up, was overwhelmingly Italian. And when I was a kid, that's where my relatives lived, and it was overwhelmingly Italian. And as you note, there are as many Russians as Brighton Beach, as many Chinese as Sunset Park. It's not Welcome Back Kotter and Vinnie Barbarino anymore.
I'm excited about it. As you could, I'm Italian. And Bensonhurst is a special place. I do live in the Bronx, actually. But in Pelham Bay, in the Bronx.
Well, that used to be the dividing line between the Italians and the Jews. Is that changed?
Actually, it's a mixed European. It's mixed community that is now taking in more Hispanics and Eastern Europeans, people from Albania, for example. But in Brooklyn, what happened was as the Italians left the city, they left this huge vacuum because Bensonhurst was the largest Italian community in New
Sure.
York. And it's been filled by the Russians and by the Chinese most heavily and by a whole bunch of other groups. And it's amazing to watch this tremendous turnover occur, okay? And it's occurring essentially in a fairly harmonious way. And with an appreciation, I think, by most people of what they have. And that's what's so special here. I think people who live in this city appreciate. I always say, we'll look back, 100 years from now, people will look back and say, it must have been incredible living in this place. And I always tell students and anybody who'll listen that the way we look back 100 years ago, people will look back at us 100 years from now and say, how did they do it?
Wow.
And that's what's really special. I mean, the uniqueness of bringing people together. By the way, I don't want to neglect the other boroughs. I can pick train lines or I can pick walking paths through northern portion of Staten Island, the western corridor of the Bronx, where the population from Ghana and the population of new African immigrants has moved in lock, stock, and barrel. Northern Manhattan, southern portion of Manhattan. I can pick so many corridors.
You love this.
Well, it's so cool because it doesn't happen many places, and that's as much as we would love to have this happen all over. The chemistry here is such that it works, and we need to find the formula, you see, and figure out how to take it to other places. And in a sense, that's why I'm here, because that's kind of like what I like to do. Appreciation breeds that kind of thinking, and that's what makes it really special.
We need to break off this fascinating neighborhood tour. When we return, Joe and I will be joined by Stacey Cumberbatch, New York City's 2010 Census Coordinator. Welcome, Stacey. Stacey is New York City's Census Coordinator. Okay, give us a little Census 101. Why it's important, how it works. Go to it.
So the census is required by the United States Constitution. It happens every 10 years. And what it requires is a count of every person residing in the United States and its territories.
So it's an enumeration.
It's an enumeration. Got to get everybody. And it's an enumeration of everyone, regardless of citizenship status, regardless of legal status. It's a count of everyone. The next census is 2010. It's going to occur in March of next year. And basically what happens is the Census Bureau mails out a questionnaire to every household in the United States to answer certain questions and to mail the form back.
Okay. And this census form is a uniform form this year. You don't have a long form. Everything is this sort of very short form.
That's right. This is the shortest form in the history of the census.
Why?
It's only 10 questions. It's a basic enumeration of the whole population for a couple of purposes. One is for purposes of reapportionment, to determine congressional representation.
And state legislative and city council.
Exactly. And it's also used to determine federal funding to the city. So a lot of federal programs are driven in part by census numbers, total numbers of population.
So you want a real count.
Accurate count.
But in the past, we've been undercounted. I know, Joe, you've been involved in many fights with the Census Bureau over the undercount and have been an advisor to the Census Bureau on how to avoid undercounts.
Well, our worst undercount was in 1990, actually. 2000, we think we did pretty well in the 2000 census. And what's happened, though, since 2000 is we have a whole new world that we're living in. And as a result, there are a lot of concerns, which is the main impetus behind the creation of the Census Office.
Okay, so on April 1st, 2009, you've got Executive Order 127 establishing your office, I guess, to ensure an accurate count.
That's right. So Mayor Bloomberg established this office by executive order, realizing the challenge of the count in New York City. As Joe and you were talking earlier, this is the most vibrant, diverse city in the United States, if not the world. And we are so diverse on so many different levels that it is our strength, but it also poses a challenge to ensuring an accurate count.
How so?
For example, we're 8.36 million people, but we know that almost 37% of our population is foreign born, many of whom, almost 600,000, have come since 2000.
So you're talking about...
So these are new New
Yorkers. About San Francisco or Boston moving in.
So it's an issue of people don't know what this is. It happens every 10 years. So we have new New Yorkers that don't know what it is. We have New Yorkers that were here in 2000 that don't remember the process and what it was. So it's either educating people about what it is, refamiliarizing people about what it is, explaining why it's important to participate, that the information is confidential.
And it's absolutely
confidential under federal law. It stays so for 72 years. And any census worker with the federal government, if they ever disclose that information, they could face up to a $250,000 fine or 5 years of imprisonment. So this information is not shared with any federal agency, state agency.
But you've got to convince people that this is the case.
And yes, you have to convince them about that, and you have to convince them that why it's important to do the census and what this information is used for.
Okay. Now, in 2000, as your testimony before the House Committee suggests, you had a 55% response rate in New York, but you had a 67% count nationally. What's the adverse impact of that lower than national average count?
Well, it means we're not getting accurate information about who is here in the city, number one. It also has implications for, obviously, our representation and apportionment in Congress and how lines are drawn. And it has implication for federal money. So if people are not counted, doesn't mean that they don't need services. It means that we don't know they're here, so money is not going to be allotted to account for them and to provide those services.
Why the low responses? And are there particular areas of the city that are prone to this low response rate?
I mean, New York City as a large, dense metropolis is considered a hard-to-count area generally by census definition of hard to count because we're large, we're dense, we have ethnic enclaves, we have a lot of renters are considered harder to count than homeowners. So all of these factors compound to make this a difficult place. But on top of that, because of our diversity, both in terms of culture, ethnicity, language, logistics, in terms of the way people live, we have a lot of homes where they may be a one-family home, but it could be 3 families living and residing
double, tripled, and
exactly.
quadrupled up.
So they will get one form for that household.
So how do you overcome these difficulties?
So there's a multitude of strategies, and it really comes down to looking neighborhood by neighborhood and outreaching to trusted voices and organizations, whether those be nonprofits, elected officials, faith-based leaders, and really mapping the city. We have worked with Joe's office, and he's really mapped where different things are going on in terms of where different new groups are settling, as well as how different neighborhoods did in the 2000 census. So all of that data combined gives us a good picture of where we need to focus some of our attention. Now, we have to focus our attention on all of the city.
Right.
But we have to acknowledge that there are certain neighborhoods within New York City and certain ethnic groups within New York City that need particular outreach to make sure that they understand what this is and that they participate.
Let's look at these hard-to-count populations. Where are they? I mean, you've got this map, and you can see it color-coded.
So the map of New York City's mail-in response rate to the census in 2000 was 55% overall. And if you look at the map, you can see there are darker shadings of maroon, red on the map, and those are very low response rate neighborhoods. They are below 40%. And those are historical low response rate neighborhoods. So it's not that 2000 was the first time.
Why?
Well, I think there's a lot of things at play. I think people don't understand what the census is. They're reluctant to give up personal information on a form that they're not really clear about, what is it used for, what benefit comes to my community as a result, and a basic mistrust. So it's really first and foremost talking about what this is. Why is this important? What does it mean in terms of financial resources to the community for childcare, for education, for infrastructure? What does it mean for political representation and being counted? And that if you don't fill out the form for your household, you essentially don't exist for 10 years in terms of this baseline information of the population.
Who are these people? I mean, what is their demography? Are they peculiar ethnic or racial groups? Are there particular socioeconomic groups or combinations of those?
What's different about here in New York, so in New York City, most of the low response rate communities and areas are largely of the African diaspora, meaning African American, Caribbean, and African. So Central Brooklyn, Southeast Queens, Central Harlem, Northeast Bronx, by and large. Those are neighborhoods where we see from 2000 consistently lower than 40% response rate. Now, it's not all socioeconomic, because we know that, as we said, renters tend to be hard to count. However, if you look at that map, Southeast Queens is a home-owning middle-class community.
Right.
Of homeowners. So is the large swaths of the Northeast Bronx, as well as Central Brooklyn.
So explain it. Why?
So I think it's a combination of not being. We do have a lot of immigrants in that in those communities from the Caribbean.
Right.
It's an issue of people not understanding what the census is, why it's important to fill out the form, the fact that the information is confidential, that it's basic information, and that this information is also used to enforce Voting Rights Act protections. It's used to enforce civil rights laws. So there's a reason why information, basic demographic information about race and age and family, household composition is necessary and important to our communities.
Now, why the short form? I remember filling out the long form, and it was long. If everybody's getting this short form, what about all that data that you're losing?
So there's something now that has replaced the long form called the American Community Survey. And it is a survey of a statistical sampling of the population of the United States, including people in New York City. And that survey is the instrument by which the Census Bureau gets all the more rich data about what's going on in a household: income, health insurance, housing condition, education, ancestry, for example. And it's through that mechanism, and that happens on an ongoing basis. So now we don't wait every 10 years, as we did before with a long form.
How frequently is the American Community
Joe?
Survey?
Actually, we get estimates every year.
Now, how many people do they survey? I mean, this is a rigorous scientific survey of the population.
It's 250,000, approximately 250,000 households nationwide every month.
Wow.
Running continuously. I mentioned earlier that 1990 was not a very good census. After 1990, many of the people who looked at the situation concluded that part of the problem in the response with the short form was having the long form, 58 or 59 questions on it. So they decoupled it in the 90s and started this survey program, which went live in 2005. So every year we get an update of New York City's population, in its socioeconomic characteristics.
Okay. Yeah. You said that, and we're running out of time, or if we've run out of time, we're running over time. This happens in March. You'll be here in February to explain this,
Absolutely.
preach this.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Prayer.
And we are reaching out to all communities. We're doing it now. There are two things I want to mention. One is there is a request for proposal put out by the state of New York. They're going to be giving out $2 million to community-based groups to do outreach around the census. That proposal is out right now. They can go to the New York State website for the Department of State. The deadline's October 16th. We are encouraging community groups here in New York City, particularly in all these. They have all the maps that we just showed to really apply for that funding, because we know that makes a difference in small community-based groups having some resources to really get the word out.
Okay, you're going to have an opportunity to make a further pitch in February. My thanks to Dr. Joseph Salvo and Stacey Cumberbatch. Join me next week when my guest is Anthony Flint, author of Wrestling with Moses, How Jane Jacobs Took on New York's Master Builder and Transformed the American City. Again, folks, thank you very much.
Thank you,
Thank you, Doug.
Hello, I'm Doug Musio. Let us know what you think about this show. You can reach us at CUNY.tv. When you get there, click on the bar that says Contact Us and send your email. Whatever it is. Thanks, no thanks, obnoxious, do it. Send it.